Okay, so this is a beginner's guide to Photoshop. When you open Photoshop, you'll most likely be greeted with a screen that looks like this. You've got two ways of opening up a file that you want to. You can either click on Open here, or you can click on the very top, click on File, and then Open from there. Okay, so we click on Open, and it will automatically bring up a folder that you were last working in Photoshop. Now you can see on the left-hand side there I've got various different folders. So we're just for an example going to pick this image here by double-clicking on it, and it should just open into Photoshop like so. Once it's in Photoshop, you now have the ability now to work on this picture as it is. You've got all of your tools that you can use to edit the picture down the left-hand side. They may look slightly different if you've clicked this option here, and they might be slightly shorter, depending on where you've got, but we'll explain the tools as we go. You can gain access to all the various bits and bobs in Photoshop, either through keyboard shortcuts, which we can talk about, or also at the top of the screen here, you have extra and additional options which are pretty much the same bits. Every bit in Photoshop has at least two ways of getting to it, but you will find everything on the top or down the side. Over on the right hand side of the screen, you've got extra information about what's going on. So down the bottom here, the most important bit is layers, that will show you what's going on there. And what I always recommend before you start anything is if you click on Window, scroll down until you see History, and make sure that one's ticked. When it's ticked, you should have a folder up or an icon open up here, a little palette for you, and it will show you all the workings that you're doing to your picture as we progress, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So the tools we've got on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got a move tool, which will allow you to move the image around. Now, if you have more than one layer, that would be quite useful. You can move the top layer against the bottom layer. So if I give you an example of that, I'll create another layer. So I've got two layers now. Now, using the move tool, I can move one layer above the other layer. Okay. So that's just literally clicking on that tool there with the four-way arrows, left-clicking your mouse and dragging the top layer around. Now you can see that's added to the history, so it's showing that I've moved that. If I want to undo any action throughout Photoshop, you could go to Edit and Undo, or a keyboard shortcut would be Control or Command Z, and that will take you back one stage. You can see we've moved back on the history. Below the move tool, as it is a rectangular selector tool, a rectangular marquee tool. And if you click and drag across, you make a rectangular selection, and it will appear with a little black and white dotted line like that. Every action you now take will apply within that rectangular box. So if, for example, you wanted to edit adjustments and change the exposure, you could brighten up just that square, and it doesn't affect the rest of the image. Okay. If you right-click on the marquee tool, you can have a choice of different selections. So if you wanted a round tool, you can choose that. It's the same principle. You'll be able to edit anything within that selection. However, if you wanted to edit outside of the selection, at the very top of the screen, you can click on Select Inverse. And now everything but that bit in the middle will be altered. So if we go to adjustments, exposure, darken that down, you can see we've now made a selection around that. To get rid of the selection, you can go to select and deselect, and all of a sudden we're back to where we were. Or you can, on your keyboard, press Control and D for deselect, and it does exactly the same thing. If you now, I don't like that selection that we've done there, that exposure and so on, so I could go back to select inverse, or I can press Control Z on my keyboard twice, and it goes back to where we were. The tool below is a lasso tool. So if you see this little icon, you can click and drag, and you can draw your own selection. So if you wanted to be a bit artistic, you can physically draw around a selection as you choose. If you want to make a right click on that, you have a I can't even say it, a different version of the same thing, where you would click and it draws in little lines, and you have to connect them for it to work. And the final version would be a magnetic lasso tool, where it attaches to the differing contrast as you click around, and you can see the little points there that you can work with. And if you think you've gone too far, you can go back to the previous point and undo it, and so on. I don't personally like this tool. I wouldn't ever choose to use the magnetic tool. I find it a bit clunky, but some of you may find a use for it that I haven't figured out yet. So if I'm using anything, it's generally the lasso tool. You may notice that I can scroll in and out of my picture, and I can also move my picture around with the hand. So here's two top tips for you. When you're setting up your Photoshop, if you were to click on Edit, go all the way down to Preferences, then click into Workspace, and you should get a box appear that looks like this. Within this box, if you click on Tools and tick this one here, Zoom with Scroll Wheel, and OK it, and then you'll be able to zoom in and out of your picture with the scroll wheel, and that will shorten down your working time. If you find that you've zoomed in, but you want to look at a bit of the picture over here, if you press and hold the space bar, a little hand will appear, and you'll be able to left click and drag the picture around. And you may find that's useful as a shortcut. Okay, so that's two top tips there for you already. The next tool down is the quick selection tool. So by clicking this, it will make a very quick selection based on where you've sort of targeted. As you can see, it's quite a big icon at the moment. You can shrink that by pressing the square brackets button on your keyboard, which should be next to P on a standard keyboard. So the square brackets, one makes it bigger, one makes that selection smaller. So you can increase and decrease the size like so. Alternatively, as is always with the Photoshop, the alternative is up here. You can increase the size like so. Okay. If for any reason you make a selection, but you want to make a part of it not part of the selection, you can either click up here and see it goes from plus to minus, and the circle now has a little minus icon in it. You can click on the minus icon and it will deselect bits that you selectively are clicking on. Alternatively, you can hold down the Alt key and it does the same thing. So just by holding down the Alt key, it changes the little icon in the middle from a plus to a minus. And you can see up there, it switches from plus to minus as you're doing it. Yeah. You also have a quick selection tool. Sorry, under here you've got an object selection tool, so you could choose to select a particular object by just covering it like so and letting Photoshop work out what the object is that you want to choose. Give it a few seconds, it'll probably catch up. Photoshop's been slow today. They just set it up like so. That's what I want. It's about to have a meltdown. The final one would be the magic wand tool, where you click and drag over the bits you want, and then you can add selectively from there. I'm not a big fan of it. I much prefer the quick selection tool. So now let's say we want to crop this image in. We don't like this corner here. The crop tool is this one here. So if you click on the crop tool, it automatically gives a selection. Now it's set me to 8 by 10, which, as you can see, is a portrait standard that way up. If I wanted to inverse that and change that to make it more of a landscape 8 by 10, I can click these two arrows at the top here and it switches it around for me. And if I'm happy with that crop, I can click the tick here or press enter and it automatically makes that crop. However, you aren't limited to 8 by 10. By clicking this button here, you can choose whichever ratio you want. So if you wanted to have an A3 ratio, which is 420 by 297, then you can plug that, put those measurements in there, press go, and it automatically selects and will maintain that standard. So if you shrink the crop in, it's going to keep the same ratio all the way through. If you don't want to maintain a particular ratio, you can just undo by clearing, have the standard ratio, and then you can just drag it to where you want it to be. So you can choose your own size if you wanted to. I don't use this tool, so I'm not going to talk about it, the frame tool. The eyedropper tool is for selecting colors. If you watch this palette here, it's gray at the moment. If I select this color here, it automatically turns to green. So if I was to use a brush tool, I would then be painting in that color, which you may find useful. Below that is a clone stamp tool. The clone stamp is for cloning bits of the picture to another part of the picture. So if I was wanting to clone this flower, I could increase the size of my selection. I would have to choose where I want to start from. So let's just say I want to clone the flower itself. So I would choose here. I would press and hold the Alt key until this target appears on screen. I then left click and that becomes the original bit that I'm cloning. So if I move across to here, left and just come down, it's going to clone from that point in time. Now again, that can be quite useful for hiding things, for brushing out things, all of those good things. So the clone tool has a lot of use. Play with it yourself, have a go, see what you want to see, how it works for you. The brush tool is below. So brush would be literally brushing a color on, or if we're working in layers, which we'll do as another lesson, you might use a layers and then a layer mask and brush out a bit of that. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, then we'll do that as another lesson another time. But a simple brush up here gives you two choices initially of either a soft brush or a hard brush. And you may be wondering what the difference is. A soft brush is simply, let me just change the color a second. History brush, that's why. My apologies, I've gone too far. Brush is up here. So brush, a soft brush looks like this. And I increase the size to show you what I mean. A soft brush has a feathered edge to it, so you can brush up against things and it doesn't look quite as unnatural maybe as a hard brush might. A hard brush has its moments, but is literally a circle. So there's no edge to it, it's either on or off. Below that, you have the eraser tool, and that's quite funky. It would allow you to selectively choose to brush out and erase bits that you may not like. So you might so there's a bit of something there you wouldn't necessarily choose, and you would erase it from your image. But you can see it's very destructive. You are literally rubbing out bits of your image. So again, be very careful about what you choose to erase. Wouldn't be my choice to do that because it is so destructive, and once you've done it, it's hard to undo it. You have a gradient tool, which as it says, will allow you to add a gradient that starts at a solid color and fades to what it would be, whatever color else you choose. And you can choose how much fade you have by dragging it up or down, so you can have a short fade, long fade. You can also choose the type of fade, so you might have it from a circle and different options from up here. Again, you might want to play with that. You might find a use for it, but it's not something I use regularly unless I'm masking, which again would be a different lesson. So we won't do that. Go back, deselect. Every time, incidentally, I go back in my history, if I was to go from, let's see, we were just on the gradient tool. If I move all the way back up to here where I go deselect, if I now make a change, let's say I go to a brush tool, if you watch all of this history here, the moment I click on brush, all of that disappears and it starts again from the last point. So if you move back and you may then make an amendment, you're going to lose all the history of what you've done after where you've decided to move back to. I hope that makes sense. So anything you change from there on will be a fresh start for you. So be aware of that. Now for club, sorry, we also got the pen tool, which I am not a fan of as selections, so I'm not going to talk about. And you've also got a text tool, which allows you to type on your image. Like so. Again, you can change it by clicking into it, and then you've got the option then to change the color of the text if you wanted to. If you wanted a red text, for example, by clicking on the palette up here, you could choose to move it around, and you could choose to have it in 3D if you particularly wanted to. I'm not going to click on the 3D because it takes too long to render and isn't something I want to do particularly. But the text tool has its uses if you're creating something and you want to add a bit of word to explain what it is. You might find it useful, or you might be just typing in editorial. Any of those things you'll be able to do using the text tool. Now, actually, let's just go back. The next thing I want you to know would be how to expand something. Let's just say we clicked on the text here. So we're on that layer, see it's up there as text. If you were to press Control and T, you press Control and T, you are then opening up a free transform. And free transform allows you to drag this box that you've got, so the text, for example, to make it bigger. You can left click in the middle and drag it around the image. You wanted it somewhere else. Or you could click in the middle and make it thinner. And if it's locked as a standard set, so it's holding its shape all the way through. If I didn't want that, I wanted it to be narrow, I can press and hold Shift, grab that thing and pull it in, and it will just become narrower. So if you were ever wanting to crop or expand an image, but you don't want it to hold its standard ratio, you press and hold Shift. Okay. Or window. What's my history? There we go. So let's go back to that. So when we're at Club, we're talking about sending things in a certain size. So if we're sending images in for a competition, they've got to be 1600 by 1200, no more than. So how would you do that? Well, there's two things you've got to do before that, really. Well, they're not two things, actually. So let's look at the standard size. Let's do that first, shall we? So the standard size is 1600 by 400. So you want to go to Image, Image Size, and it will open up a box like this. Now this, if it's not on pixels, if it's on percentage or if it's on inches or centimeters, change the drop-down box to pixels. At the moment, it's picked up what the camera was taken at originally, whatever size that might be. This is a landscape picture, meaning that it's the longest edges at the bottom here. So if I make the width 1600, because these two things are connected, you can see how they are linked with a chain in the middle here. It's automatically resized the height to 1067, which works for Club, would be good for us. That's well within the 1600 by 1200. And if we OK that, you'll see the picture shrink on screen, hopefully. There it is. So it's been resized now. Okay, it's the same picture. It's just got less pixels, so we can be displayed on our projector at a standard for everybody. The other thing you've got to be mindful of is the color spacing. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. When we are, if you are wanting to resize an image, and let's say it was taller rather than longer, you would need to choose that to start with, because you can see, because the length is longer than the height, if I was to make my selection based on the height of the image of 1200, it automatically makes the picture bigger on the longer side. So it's too big for 1600. So that's not going to work for me. So therefore, you've got to pick the longest side and make that your resolution. So if the picture was, let's make it a, let's crop it 10 by 8. Do that. So now the picture is now taller than it is longer. So if we were to resize it, you can see the height is going to be taller than the width. So you would choose the height first and accept that the width is not going to be the same. I hope that makes sense. Any questions, drop me an email. The other thing to consider for Club would be that you've got to get the correct color spacing. Now, color spacing is how the image is going to be displayed on our screens. So first thing you've got to do is go to Edit, all the way down to Convert to Profile. And this is what you want it to look like, sRGB, okay? If it's anything other than that, It's not going to work for you. So you would have to check sRGB. Lots of work you do in Photoshop will be ProPhoto RGB or Adobe RGB, but it must be sRGB for Club. Once you change that, click OK. There is a big difference between converting to profile and assigning profile. If you assign a profile, let's say we choose something different. I don't know, let's pick something crazy. It may well affect the colors within your image. It's not a good example. Hasn't made any difference at all, but it may well project very differently. So, I don't know. See if that makes a difference. No, none of these are good examples, but effectively, make sure it's converted, not assigned. Okay. So let's put that back to. You can see the difference actually now. And then we convert to profile, and OK. So you've done all of that good things. Now you may also want to add a black line or what is known as a stroke around the image for when you're sending into Club. If you go over to your layers panel, so you've got up here, you can select layer and duplicate layer and background copy, and you have another layer panel. The keyboard shortcut for that is Control J or Command J. It does the same thing. You'll end up with two of the same pictures, one above the other. From here, click on FX down the bottom, scroll up to stroke, and it should open up with stroke like this, and you can choose the size of the stroke, of how much you want it to be. I've chosen inside because that makes the most sense, because it's inside the picture so you can actually see it. And then you can change the color by clicking on this icon, and if you want to pick a color that matches your image, you can do so like that by clicking the little color palette option here, and it will automatically change it. Click OK. OK there. And Bob's your uncle. So now we've got two more choices about how we're going to save this and if we're going to save it like it is. You may choose to flatten your image, and what that means is to compress it all back down to one picture rather than having two layers. It's better for storage, and if you wanted to do that, you would go to Layer and Flatten Image. And you watch there, you've got one image now, that's it. That does mean that you've now flattened it all back down, so if you wanted to make changes, you'll be making changes with it exactly as it is. And if you were to do that and save it, it would write over the original picture that you had. So if you were flatten the image and were to cross out there, it would ask you if you wanted to save it. You say yes, and you've all of a sudden that is what you're saving at that size. You've overwritten your original image. So the better alternative would be to go to File and Save a Copy. And when you do that, it will bring it back to the folder it got it from, and you can save it in there as a copy of that picture. So if you wanted it as a JPEG, which is what you'll need for Club, you just click Save, away you go. If you're saving a piece of work that you are wanting to go back to, or you're conscious that you don't want to keep dipping in and out of it, or you want to dip in and out of it, sorry, then you may choose to save it as a TIFF. A TIFF file is non-destructive. It's a lossless file, whereas a JPEG will gradually deteriorate the more times you go and open it up and work on it. So if you keep opening up a JPEG file over time, it loses data, it becomes a lossy file, whereas a TIFF file, you can open and close it as many times as you like, and it retains its data. If you've done a lot of work to a particular image, and you've got lots and lots of layers, sometimes you may have 20, 30 layers here, you may want to choose to save that as a Photoshop document, a PSD, in which case you go to File, Save as a Copy, and you'll change it from JPEG to Photoshop file, which is a PSD at the top there. And it will save then as a Photoshop file, but it will create, and every time you open it, it will open up with all the layers that you've been working on. It's a much bigger file, so be careful about how many times you decide to do this because it'll eat up lots of space in your hard drive. But useful if you plan on doing some work and then going back to it later on. So there we go. So that's how you open. You've got the tools. You can create the image for club competitions at the right size. You can add a stroke to it, and you can send it, and you can save it then as a JPEG. I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me at the club or send me an email. And we'll carry on with our training and look at layers and actual editing soon. All the best. Speak soon.